The crimson blooms of the Asterian death lotus pulsed with hypnotic beauty, their petals seeming to breathe in the planet's amber twilight. Tobias Kane knelt carefully beside the rare specimen, his collection kit spread across the mossy ground of the research station's botanical preserve. 3 years studying the flora of this remote world, and he'd never seen anything quite like it. Magnificent, isn't it? The voice startled him, melodic, with an accent that seemed to make the words shimmer in the air. Tobias looked up to see a figure approaching through the crystalline trees, and his breath caught. She was Luminari, one of the native people of Asteria, but unlike any he'd encountered before. Where most Luminari glowed with soft, steady light beneath their translucent skin, this woman radiated brilliance like captured starfire, tall and graceful, with hair that flowed like liquid silver and eyes the color of nebulae. She wore robes that seemed woven from moonbeams themselves. Your Grace. Tobias rose quickly, recognizing the formal bearing and the intricate light patterns that marked nobility among her people. I didn't realize anyone else would be in the preserve today. She smiled, and the very air seemed to warm. I am Zavera, Duchess of the Northern Reaches, and you must be the human botanist my advisors speak of. Tobias Kane, is it not? Yes, Your Grace. I hope I'm not intruding. Not at all. I confess, I've been curious about your work. She moved closer to the death lotus, her inner light casting rainbow patterns through the preserve's canopy. My people have known these flowers for millennia, yet you study them as if discovering something new. Tobias felt heat rise in his cheeks. I suppose to you my research must seem elementary. On the contrary, Zavera knelt beside the flower, her movements fluid as water. You see connections we've missed, patterns we've taken for granted. Last week, your published notes on the symbiosis between thornwhistle vines and crystal moths opened entirely new avenues of understanding for our scholars. The compliment warmed him more than it should have. I just observed differently, I suppose. Human eyes, human perspective. Precisely. She reached toward the death lotus, her fingers hovering just above the largest bloom, which is why I wanted to ask you about this particular specimen. We've noticed behavioral changes in the local wildlife. Don't touch it. Tobias lunged forward as Zavera's hand moved toward the flower, but he was too late. Her fingers brushed the petals, and immediately, the bloom released a cloud of sparkling spores. The Duchess gasped, her natural luminescence flickering as the toxic particles settled on her skin. The pollen, she whispered, swaying. I didn't know. Zero toxin, Tobias said grimly, catching her as she stumbled. Highly poisonous to Luminari. Nervous systems. We have maybe 10 minutes before it reaches your core light. Her skin was already dimming, the vibrant patterns beneath fading to pale echoes. My guards, she managed. They're too far away. Tobias supported her weight, his mind racing. The research station's medical facility was equipped for human emergencies, not Luminari physiology. But in his 3 years here, he'd studied more than just plants. There's an antidote, he said, half carrying her toward his field laboratory. But it requires direct contact with your light channels. The cultural protocols will not matter if I'm dead, Zavera finished, though her voice was growing weaker. Do what you must. The next several minutes blurred together in desperate urgency. Tobias worked with practiced precision, synthesizing compounds from local flora while monitoring the Duchess's fading luminescence. When the antidote was ready, he hesitated only a moment before placing his hands on her temples, feeling the electric tingle of her life force beneath his palms. Luminari considered such contact sacred, reserved for family or bonded partners. But as the antidote flowed through her system, guided by his touch, Zavera's light began to return. Slowly, carefully, he traced the pathways of her energy matrix, ensuring the toxin was fully neutralized. When her eyes opened again, they blazed with restored brilliance. You saved my life, she said simply. I did my job. Tobias stepped back, suddenly aware of how improper the situation might appear. Any researcher would have. No. Zavera sat up, her recovered radiance making the small laboratory seem to pulse with living light. You risked cultural taboo, potentially diplomatic incident, to preserve someone you barely know. More than that, you understood luminary physiology well enough to craft an antidote in moments. She stood, and Tobias was struck again by her regal bearing, now restored to full magnificence. Among my people, such an act creates a bond that cannot be easily dismissed. You have saved not just my life, but the continuation of my bloodline. Your Grace, I don't expect any special recognition, but you shall have it." Her voice carried new authority, formal and binding. "By the ancient laws of the Stellar Compact, when one preserves the light of a duchess, a debt is incurred that must be honored. I invoke the right of starbound gratitude." Tobias had heard whispers of such traditions, but had never seen them enacted. "What does that mean, exactly?" Zevra's expression grew solemn. "It means, Tobias Kane, that I must offer you that which is most precious to my house, my 3 daughters Naya, Vera, and Leela, each unique in her gifts, each worthy of the strongest bonds. They will present themselves to you as potential life partners, should such connections prove worthy of formation." The words hit him like a physical blow. "Your Grace, I couldn't possibly. The law is clear." She continued, though not unkindly. "They will test you, each in her own way, to determine if bonds of affection might take root alongside bonds of duty. You need not accept all, or any, but you must allow them the opportunity to know your heart as you saved my life." Before Tobias could protest further, a soft chimming filled the air. 3 figures materialized in the laboratory's doorway. Having apparently been summoned by some signal he hadn't noticed, the first was tall and athletic, with light that pulsed in steady, strong rhythms beneath skin marked by faint scars of adventure. Her silver hair was braided with small crystalline ornaments that caught and reflected her inner radiance. When she looked at him, her eyes held the sharp intelligence of someone accustomed to reading danger and opportunity in equal measure. The second daughter moved with subtle grace, her luminescence more complex layered patterns that shifted like equations written in living light. She carried herself with the quiet confidence of someone who wielded knowledge as others might weapons. Her gaze seemed to catalog and analyze everything it touched, including him. The youngest was different from her sisters, her light dancing, rather than pulsing, creating swirling aurora patterns that spoke of artistic temperament and emotional depth. Where the others observed him with calculation, she studied him with frank curiosity. As if he were a puzzle she looked forward to solving. "My daughters," Zavera said formally. "Naya, warrior scout of the northern reaches; Vera, keeper of our ancient knowledge; and Leela, whose gifts lie in the realm of emotion and connection." Each woman stepped forward in turn, offering the traditional luminary greeting, a brief touch of fingertips that allowed a moment of shared light. Tobias felt a different energy from each, strength from Naya, depth from Vera, warmth from Leela. "The trials will begin tomorrow," Zavera announced. "Each daughter will test you according to her nature. Should genuine affection develop alongside respect, bonds may be formed. Should they not," she gestured gracefully, "then the debt will be considered satisfied through the attempt alone." As the formal presentations concluded and the daughters departed, Tobias found himself alone with the Duchess once more. "Your Grace," he began carefully, "I hope you understand this is quite overwhelming for someone from my culture." Zevra's expression softened. "I do understand, Tobias, but I also believe that the best connections transcend cultural boundaries. My daughters are extraordinary individuals who deserve the chance to form bonds based on genuine compatibility, not mere political arrangement." She moved toward the laboratory's entrance, then paused. "Besides," she added with something that might have been amusement, "you may find that being tested by them is far more pleasant than you anticipate." After she left, Tobias stood alone among his equipment and specimens, the normal routine of his research suddenly seeming impossibly distant. Tomorrow, 3 remarkable women would begin evaluating him as a potential partner, each according to her own standards and desires. He looked out through the laboratory's crystal windows, at Asteria's double moons rising over the preserve. Somewhere, out there, 3 sisters were probably discussing their impressions of the human who had saved their mothers. Life. The thought should have terrified him. Instead, as he considered Naya's strength, Vera's mystery, and Lila's warmth, Tobias found himself anticipating tomorrow with something remarkably close to excitement. Perhaps he mused as he began cleaning up his equipment. Being in debt to a duchess might not be such a terrible fate after all. Tobias woke before sunrise to find Naya waiting outside his quarters, silhouetted against Asteria's pre-dawn glow. She wore practical travel gear that enhanced rather than concealed her athletic build, and her luminescence pulsed with barely contained energy ready for an adventure. "Botanist?" she asked, shouldering a pack that seemed designed for serious expedition work. "I suppose that depends on what kind of adventure," Tobias replied, trying to match her confident tone while internally wondering what he'd gotten himself into. Naya's smile was sharp and genuine, the kind that separates those who merely study life from those who truly live it. They left the research station as the first moon began to set, traveling on foot through terrain that grew increasingly wild with each kilometer. Naya moved with the easy confidence of someone born to the wilderness, while Tobias found himself working harder than he cared to admit to keep pace. "Tell me about your world," she said as they paused beside a stream of liquid crystal that sang as it flowed. "What adventures did you seek before coming to Asteria?" Tobias scooped the melodic water into his canteen, considering the question. "I'm not sure I'd call them adventures. Research expeditions, mostly. Cataloging plant life on frontier worlds. And that doesn't count as adventure?" Naya raised an eyebrow. "You've traveled between stars to study life forms that could kill you with a touch. How is that not pursuing danger for the sake of discovery?" Put that way, his work did sound more exciting than he usually considered it. "I suppose I don't think of research as adventure. It's methodical, careful, boring," Naya finished with a grin. "At least, that's what most people assume. But I've read your published papers. The expedition to the crystal caves of Mandara, the toxic spore forests of Velter. You've faced things that would terrify career warriors." Her words surprised him. "You've read my research, all of it." They resumed walking, following a path that seemed to exist only in Naya's memory. "Mother taught us to understand those we might bond with. Your work shows someone who seeks truth regardless of personal risk. That's attractive in a partner." The casual admission sent warmth through Tobias's chest. "And what do you seek, Naya?" "Life lived fully," she said without hesitation. "Experiences that matter, bonds that deepen rather than simply endure. Too many Luminari nobles choose safety over growth, comfort over connection." They crested a ridge as Asteria's primary sun began to rise, revealing a vista that took Tobias's breath away. A valley stretched below them, filled with formations he'd never seen before, towering spires of what looked like crystallized light, connected by bridges of pure energy. "The Singing Gardens," Naya said softly. "One of our most sacred places, and one of our most dangerous," as if summoned by her words. A low harmonic them filled the air. The crystal formations pulsed in rhythm, creating patterns of sound and light that seemed almost alive. "It's beautiful," Tobias whispered, "and deadly." Naya pointed to bones scattered around the valley floor, the remains of creatures who had wandered too close to the formations. "The harmonics can overwhelm nervous systems, cause hallucinations, even death, but they also hold the key to understanding our deepest selves." She turned to face him, her expression serious. "This is my trial, Tobias, to reach the heart of the gardens together and return. Many have tried alone and failed. The harmonics require two minds working in perfect harmony to navigate safely. And if we fail?" Naya's smile returned, but softer this time. "Then we'll fail together, which is better than succeeding alone." The descent into the valley tested every skill Tobias had developed in his years of field research. The harmonics grew stronger with each step, creating auditory illusions that made simple navigation treacherous. More than once, he found himself stepping toward what looked like solid ground, only to have Naya's hand pull him back from a dangerous drop. "Listen to my heartbeat," she instructed as they approached the most dangerous section. "Let your breathing match mine." Tobias found himself acutely aware of her presence, the rhythm of her pulse, visible in the patterns of light beneath her skin, the steady cadence of her breathing, the way her inner radiance seemed to create a protective bubble around them both. "There," she murmured as they reached a platform surrounded by the most intense formations. "Do you hear it?" At first, Tobias heard only the overwhelming symphony of the crystals, But gradually, beneath the chaos, he began to detect a deeper pattern, a rhythm that seemed to match their synchronized heartbeats. The garden is alive, he realized, and it recognizes those who can work in true partnership, Naya confirmed. This is what I needed to know about you, Tobias. Can you trust enough to synchronize not just your steps, but your very life force with another? What followed was unlike anything in Tobias's experience. Moving through the garden's heart required absolute faith in Naya's guidance, while she simultaneously relied on his insights to read the patterns in the crystalline formations. When she leaped across a gap that seemed impossibly wide, he followed without question. When he detected a harmonic shift that warned of danger ahead, she changed course without hesitation. By the time they reached the garden's center, a pool of liquid light that reflected not their physical forms, but the patterns of their inner selves. They were moving as one entity. Look, Naya breathed out on the pool's surface. Their reflections had merged into something beautiful and stranger. Strength supporting his curiosity, his careful observation guiding her bold instincts. The sight filled Tobias with an unexpected sense of completeness. I understand now, he said. Adventure isn't about reckless danger. It's about finding someone worth taking risks for. Naya's hand found his, their fingers interlacing as naturally as their heartbeats had synchronized. And research isn't about isolation. It's about discovering truths that make shared life richer. The journey back through the gardens felt different, easier, as if the formations themselves approved of their partnership. By the time they emerged into normal daylight, something fundamental had shifted between them. So, Naya said as they made camp for the night, do I pass your trial? Tobias looked confused. Your trial? I thought I was the one being tested. We test each other, she said simply. That's how real partnerships work. That night, as they shared stories around a small fire, Tobias found himself opening up in ways that surprised him. Naya listened with the same intensity she brought to everything else, asking questions that revealed depths he hadn't known he possessed. My sisters will offer different challenges, she said as the dual moons reached their zenith. Vera will test your mind, Leela your heart. But know this, whatever bonds form or fail to form with them, what we discovered in the gardens is real. She moved closer, her luminescence creating intimate shadows around them. I choose you, Tobias Kane, not from duty or debt, but because you've shown me that adventure and stability, risk and wisdom, can exist in the same person. When she kissed him, her light seemed to flow into him, creating patterns beneath his own skin that matched her radiance. For a moment, human and luminary became something entirely new, a connection that transcended species and culture. Tomorrow, you meet Vera, Naya murmured against his lips. But tonight, you're mine. As they lay together under Asteria's impossible sky, Tobias realized that he was no longer the same man who had knelt beside a death lotus just days before. Naya had awakened something in him, not just attraction, but a hunger for the kind of partnership that made both individuals stronger. One trial down, he thought drowsily as Naya's steady breathing lulled him toward sleep. 2 more to go. But already, he suspected that the real challenge wouldn't be winning the approval of 3 extraordinary women. It would be learning to see himself as worthy of their love. Tobias found Vera in the research station's most unusual location, a chamber carved from living crystal that hummed with frequencies just below the range of human hearing. She sat motionless in the center, surrounded by floating holographic symbols that shifted and danced in complex patterns around her. Knowledge, she said without opening her eyes, is not information collected but understanding achieved. Do you know the difference, Tobias? He studied the symbols floating around her, recognizing some as mathematical formulas while others remained completely alien. Information is what we observe. Understanding is what we do with those observations. Vera's eyes opened, revealing irises that held depth like looking into star-filled space. A good beginning, but incomplete. The symbols around her pulsed once, then vanished. My trial for you is not of the body, like Naya's, but of the mind and spirit together. She rose gracefully, her movements precise as a dancer's. Where Naya radiated energy and strength, Vera embodied stillness and depth. Her luminescence was subtle, complex patterns within patterns that seemed to hold meaning just beyond comprehension. "What do you know of our history?" she asked, leading him from the crystal chamber toward a section of the research station he'd never explored. "The basic outline," Tobias replied. "The Luminari developed spaceflight roughly 2 millennia ago, established the stellar compact, became renowned as mediators and scholars. Facts," Vera said dismissively. "Data points. But do you understand why we became mediators? What drives a species to seek resolution rather than conquest?" They stopped before a doorway that seemed to be made of solid shadow. Vera placed her hand against its surface, and slowly, light began to seep through not the warm radiance of her skin, but something older, more complex. "Before we learned to reach the stars," she said as the door dissolved, "we nearly destroyed ourselves reaching inward. Beyond the threshold lay a space that defied physical logic. The chamber was larger than the entire research station, filled with artifacts that seemed to exist in multiple dimensions simultaneously. Crystalline structures held memories made visible, while streams of pure thought flowed between preservation devices that contained fragments of living history. "A repository," Tobias breathed. "The memories of our species," Vera confirmed. "Every significant thought, discovery, and mistake preserved for those willing to seek understanding." She led him deeper into the impossible space, past artifacts that whispered with the voices of ancient luminari. "We developed telepathic abilities long before we developed wisdom to use them responsibly. Imagine, if you will, a society where every thought, every emotion, every private moment could be shared involuntarily." Tobias tried to envision such a world and shuddered. It would be chaos. It was. Vera stopped before a crystalline structure that pulsed with dark, turbulent light. Wars fought over unspoken thoughts, relationships destroyed by emotions meant to remain private. "We came within generations of extinction before we learned to control our gifts." She gestured to the artifact, and suddenly Tobias could see the history she described. Luminari cities in flames as telepathic conflicts raged through the streets. Families torn apart by abilities that revealed too much, too quickly, without the wisdom to process such intimate knowledge. "This is why we became mediators," Vera continued, "because we learned the hardest lesson any species can learn, that connection without understanding is as destructive as isolation without empathy." They moved deeper into the repository, past artifacts that showed the slow development of luminari philosophy, the careful cultivation of mental disciplines that allowed their abilities to become gifts rather than curses. "My trial," Vera said, as they reached the repository's hardest sphere of perfect clarity that reflected not light, but thought itself, "is to determine whether you possess the wisdom to handle truly intimate connection, not just physical bonding, like Naya offers, but mental and spiritual joining that would make your thoughts, your memories, your very self accessible to another consciousness." The prospect was terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure. "What would that involve?" "A temporary merging," Vera explained, her hand hovering over the sphere's surface. "I would share my mind with yours, and you with mine. No secrets, no hidden thoughts, no private spaces. For a brief time, we would experience existence as a single consciousness." She turned to face him fully, and in her eyes he saw depths that stretched beyond individual identity. "Many cannot handle such intimacy. The self rebels against dissolution, even temporary. But for those who could accept it," her expression softened, "it's the closest to beings can come to truly knowing one another." Tobias thought of his relationship with Naya, the way their hearts had synchronized in the singing gardens. That had felt like perfect partnership. But this offered something deeper, understanding so complete that deception became impossible. "What if you don't like what you find in my mind?" he asked. Vera smiled, the expression transforming her serious features into something luminous. "What if you don't like what you find in mine?" Before he could change his mind, Tobias placed his hand on the sphere beside hers. The effect was immediate and overwhelming. His consciousness suddenly expanded beyond the boundaries of his individual mind. Through Vera's memories, he experienced her childhood as a prodigy struggling with abilities that revealed too much about others' inner lives. He felt her loneliness among peers who feared her gifts, her dedication to mastering disciplines that would make her power a blessing rather than a burden. But more than memories, he shared her present experience, her perception of him filtered through senses that revealed the very structure of his thoughts. She saw his kindness not as action, but as fundamental character trait, witnessed his curiosity as a burning flame that drove every decision, experienced his growing affection for her family, not as obligation, but as genuine wonder. In return, Vera experienced his memories of Earth, the isolation of a scholarly life spent among colleagues who valued discoveries more than the discoverers who made them. She felt his joy at finding purpose in xenobotany, his satisfaction at work that contributed to understanding between species. Most intimately, she experienced his recent transformation, how meeting her family had awakened desires he'd never acknowledged, the security he felt with Naya, the intellectual stimulation Vera herself provided, the emotional warmth Leela promised. Through his consciousness, she understood that he wasn't being tested for worthiness so much as discovering his own capacity for connection. The merging lasted only moments in real time, but felt like hours of perfect understanding. When their hands lifted from the sphere, Tobias staggered slightly, feeling oddly empty without Vera's consciousness intertwined with his. That was, he began, then found words inadequate. Overwhelming, terrifying, beautiful, Vera finished. All true, but also necessary. She moved closer, her complex luminescence creating aurora patterns in the repository's crystal walls. I needed to know if you could handle true intimacy without losing yourself. Many minds, faced with such complete exposure, either shut down entirely or become lost in the other consciousness, and I passed. You remained yourself while embracing connection, she said, her voice soft with something that might have been wonder. You experienced my thoughts without trying to control them, shared your own without shame or reservation. That's rare. Vera's hand touched his cheek, her fingers tracing patterns that seemed to echo the mental connection they'd shared. I choose you too, Tobias, not just for your compatibility with my sister, but for your own unique gifts. You have the wisdom to handle deep connection responsibly. When she kissed him, it was different from Naya's passionate embrace. This was meeting of minds as much as bodies. Understanding made physical. For a moment, their earlier mental joining seemed to echo through the contact, creating intimacy that transcended the purely physical. Leela will test your heart tomorrow, Vera murmured as they separated. But know that you've already passed the test of the mind. As they made their way back through the repository, Tobias felt fundamentally changed by the experience. The mental merging had shown him possibilities for connection. He'd never imagined ways of knowing another person that went far beyond surface attraction, or even deep affection. One question, he said as they reached the chamber's entrance, when the trials are complete, how am I supposed to choose between you, between any of you? Vera paused, her expression thoughtful. Who says you have to choose between us? Before Tobias could ask what she meant, the repository faded around them, leaving only the familiar corridors of the research station and the memory of perfect understanding, shared between two minds that had briefly become one. Leela found Tobias in his laboratory at sunset, but she wasn't alone. She'd brought music, not instruments, but something far more ethereal. The air around her seemed to sing, filled with harmonies that resonated directly with the listeners. Emotions, close your eyes, she said, her voice weaving into the ambient melody. Tell me what you feel. Tobias obeyed, immediately sensing a shift in the laboratory's atmosphere. The music seemed to paint colors behind his eyelids, warm golds of contentment, deep blues of longing, bright silvers of joy and discovery. Wonder, he said honestly, and anticipation. Good. Lila's laugh was part of the music, adding sparkle to the emotional landscape she was creating. You're more sensitive than most humans. That will make this easier. When he opened his eyes, the laboratory had been transformed. Lila's artistic abilities had turned the sterile space into something magical. Surfaces that reflected not light but emotion. Specimens that glowed with the feelings of those who observed them. Equipment that hummed in harmony with the room's occupants. How did you? Emotional resonance, Leela explained, moving through the transformed space like a dancer interpreting music only she could hear. My gift isn't just empathy, it's the ability to make feelings visible, to share inner experiences through external beauty. She wore flowing garments that shifted color with her moods, and her luminescence was unlike her sisters. Instead of steady patterns or complex layers, her light danced and swirled like aurora given form. Where Naya was strength and Vera was wisdom, Leela was pure emotional artistry. My trial, she continued, settling onto a chair that molded itself to provide perfect comfort, is to discover whether you can love not just individuals, but love itself, whether you can embrace the full spectrum of feeling without hiding behind logic or duty. The challenge seemed deceptively simple compared to Naya's physical trials, or Vera's mental mergings. And how do we do that? We dance, Leela said simply. Not with our bodies, though that may happen, but with our hearts. I'm going to share my deepest emotions with you, and you're going to let me experience yours. No barriers, no self-protection, just pure feeling allowed to flow between us. She stood, extending her hand. Trust me, the moment their fingers touched, Tobias was overwhelmed by sensation, not physical touch, but emotional contact so direct it took his breath away. Through their connection, he felt Lila's joy at meeting him, pure, uncomplicated delight at discovering someone new and interesting. But beneath the joy lay deeper currents, loneliness from being the youngest daughter, always trying to prove herself worthy of her sister's accomplishments, frustration at being seen as merely artistic, when her empathic abilities gave her insights into people that rivaled Vera's analytical skills. Don't just observe, Leela whispered, her eyes bright with unshed tears. Feel with me. Tobias stopped trying to categorize her emotions and simply experienced them. The loneliness became his loneliness, the isolation of brilliance that others couldn't fully appreciate. The frustration transformed into his own struggles with being valued for his discoveries, rather than himself. In return, his emotions flowed into her. She experienced his wonder at her family's unique gifts, his gratitude for being accepted despite their cultural differences, his growing amazement at finding not just one potential partner, but 3 women who challenged different aspects of his character. There, Leela breathed, her luminescence shifting to match the rhythm of their shared feelings. Now you're dancing with me. What followed was unlike anything in Tobias's experience. They moved through the laboratory, sometimes literally dancing, sometimes simply exploring the emotional landscape Leela had created. Every surface reflected their feelings back at them, creating feedback loops of sensation that amplified and refined their connection. Through her empathic abilities, Leela showed him emotions he'd never acknowledged, the deep satisfaction he felt when solving botanical puzzles, the longing for connection that had driven him to seek work on distant worlds, the fear of vulnerability that had kept him from forming deep relationships before meeting her family. In return, he shared memories that carried emotional weight, the excitement of his first published research, the loneliness of his parents' death, the quiet joy he found in understanding how life adapted to impossible conditions. You feel everything so deeply, Leela marveled as they sat together on the laboratory floor, surrounded by floating displays that showed their emotions as shifting mandalas of color and light. But you've taught yourself to hide it behind scientific objectivity. Feelings can cloud judgment, Tobias replied, though the words sounded hollow even to him. Feelings can cloud poor judgment, Leela corrected, but they enhance good judgment. How many of your best discoveries came from intuition rather than pure logic? As she asked the question, images flowed between them, moments when Tobias had followed hunches that led to breakthrough understanding, times when emotional connection to his work had driven him to insights that pure analysis never could have provided. You love your work, Leela continued, not just as intellectual exercise, but as emotional journey. You form connections with the life you study. That's what makes you exceptional. Her hand traced patterns on his chest, and he realized that faint luminescence was beginning to appear beneath his own skin, not luminary radiance, but something uniquely human responding to her empathic touch. I've been afraid, he admitted, of all of this, not just your family's offer, but of feeling too much, of wanting something I might not be able to have. What do you want? Leela asked, her voice soft as flower petals. The question hung in the air between them, weighted with all the emotional honesty they'd shared. In the space Leela had created, lying was impossible not because she would detect it, but because the environment itself made deception feel absurd. "I want all of you," Tobias said finally, not as obligation or cultural debt, but as choice. "I want Naya's adventures and partnership. I want Vera's understanding and mental intimacy. I want your joy and emotional connection. I want to build something with all three of you that's bigger than any individual relationship." Lila's smile was radiant, literally her luminescence, brightened until the entire laboratory glowed with warm, golden light. "Then you understand what this trial was really about. Love isn't exclusive by nature." Tobias realized it's only exclusive by choice. "And some choices," Leela said, moving closer until her forehead touched his, "create more love rather than less." When she kissed him, it was with the full force of her empathic abilities engaged. Through their connection, he felt not just her affection for him, but her love for her sisters, her joy at their growing connections with him, her excitement at the possibility of building something unprecedented. More surprisingly, through her abilities he sensed Naya and Vera's emotions as well, both sisters somewhere in the station, both aware through empathic bonds with Leela that the final trial was reaching its conclusion. "They're here," he said against her lips. "Their family," Leela replied. "And if you choose us, your family too." As if summoned by her words, the laboratory door opened to admit Naya and Vera. Neither seemed surprised by the intimate scene or the emotionally charged atmosphere Leela had created. "So," Naya said with characteristic directness, "how did he do?" "See for yourself," Leela replied, extending her hands to her sisters. What followed was a moment of perfect communication, as the three sisters shared their individual experiences of Tobias. Through Lila's empathic network, he felt exposed and vulnerable, but also accepted in a way he'd never experienced before. "One more trial," Vera said finally. "The most important one." "What's that?" Tobias asked. "Tomorrow," Naya said with a smile that mixed warmth with anticipation. "You choose, not because of debt or obligation, but because of desire, and we do the same." As the three sisters prepared to leave, Leela paused beside him. "Tonight, dream of what you truly want," she said. "Tomorrow, we'll discover if what we all want is the same thing." Alone in his transformed laboratory, surrounded by the fading echoes of emotional artistry, Tobias realized that the trials had never been about proving his worthiness to three extraordinary women. They had been about discovering that he was worthy of love, theirs and his own. The ceremony chamber in the heart of the research station had been transformed overnight. Duchess Zavera stood at its center, her regal bearing restored to full magnificence, surrounded by crystalline formations that hummed with ceremonial significance. But this wasn't the formal ritual space Tobias had expected. Instead, it felt warm, intimate, like a family gathering rather than a legal proceeding. "The trials are complete," Zavera announced as Tobias entered. "Each daughter has tested you according to her nature, and you have responded with courage, wisdom, and heart." Naya, Vera, and Leela stood together, but not in formal ranks. They had positioned themselves as sisters, their individual luminescence creating a complex pattern of shared light that spoke of unity rather than competition. "But now comes the true choice," the Duchess continued. "Not the selection of obligation, but the decision of desire. What bonds, if any, do you choose to form?" Tobias looked at each woman in turn, remembering their individual trials and discoveries. Naya's strength and partnership in the singing gardens, Vera's intellectual intimacy in the repository of memories, Lila's emotional artistry that had revealed depths he'd never acknowledged. "I need to ask you something first," he said, addressing all three sisters. "The trial with Leela showed me emotions from all of you: affection, acceptance, even love. But was that real or just the empathic connection playing tricks?" Naya stepped forward first. "Real," she said simply. "From the moment we met, I felt kinship with you, not just attraction, but recognition of a kindred spirit." "The mental joining confirmed what I suspected," Vera added. "You possess the rare combination of intelligence and wisdom that makes deep partnership possible. And you feel everything as deeply as I do," Leela finished. "You just hide it better." That's not a flaw, it's a different kind of strength. Zavera watched the exchange. With growing satisfaction, the ancient laws speak of bonds formed through gratitude, she said. But the deepest wisdom of our people recognizes that the strongest connections transcend obligation entirely. Which brings us to the real question, Tobias said, his heart pounding with nervous anticipation. In human culture, marriage is typically exclusive. One partner, one bond. But everything I've learned about Luminari society suggests different possibilities. You're asking, Vera said with characteristic directness, whether we would consider a polygamous arrangement. I'm asking, Tobias corrected, whether you would consider building something together. All of us, not traditional marriage to one person, but a family unit that honors all the connections we've discovered. The silence that followed felt eternal. Tobias waited, prepared for rejection, for the explanation that such arrangements violated some fundamental principle he didn't understand. Instead, Leela began to laugh, pure joy made audible. Did you think, she asked between giggles, that we would compete against each other? That sisters who have shared everything since childhood would suddenly become rivals? The trials weren't to determine which of us you would choose, Naya explained, moving closer. They were to discover whether all of us could choose you. Luminari bonds are not exclusive by nature, Vera added, her complex luminescence shifting into patterns that match her sister's. We form connections based on compatibility and affection, not artificial limitations. Zavera stepped forward, her expression warm with maternal pride. My daughters have always been exceptional, she said, not just individually, but in their unity. When I invoke the law of lifeblood, I hope they might find someone worthy of all their gifts. But what about human cultural expectations? Tobias asked. The Federation has no regulations regarding personal relationships between consenting adults of different species, Vera interrupted. I checked, and besides, Naya added with a grin, since when do explorers worry about conventional expectations? Leela moved to stand directly in front of him, her dancing luminescence creating aurora patterns in the chamber's crystalline walls. The question isn't whether it's conventional, she said softly. The question is whether it's what we all want. Tobias looked around the chamber at three extraordinary women who had each challenged and changed him, at a duchess who had offered him the greatest gift imaginable, at a family that had already begun to feel like home. Yes, he said simply, it's what I want, if you'll have me. What followed was unlike any ceremony in either human or luminary tradition. Instead of formal vows or legal declarations, they simply spoke their intentions to build something together, to honor individual connections while strengthening collective bonds, to create a partnership that transcended cultural boundaries. When the sisters joined hands around him, their combined luminescence created something unprecedented, patterns of light that incorporated elements of each individual radiance, while generating entirely new configurations. Through their touch, Tobias felt the emotional and mental connections formed during the trials deepening into something that would endure. In our tradition, Zavera said as the light show reached its peak, such bondings are sealed through the sharing of life force. Are you prepared for that level of intimacy? Before Tobias could ask what that meant, he felt it, a warmth spreading through his chest as the sister's luminescence began to flow into him. Not overwhelming like Vera's mental joining or emotionally intense like Lila's empathic dance, but a steady, gentle merging that felt like coming home after a long journey. Looking down, he saw patterns of light beginning to appear beneath his own skin, not quite luminary radiance, but something uniquely his own that complemented and enhanced their glow. Family, Naya said, her voice soft with wonder. Partnership, Vera added. Love, Leela whispered, as the formal ceremony concluded and they moved to private quarters that had been prepared for their new arrangement. Tobias reflected on the incredible journey that had brought him here. 3 days ago, he had been a solitary researcher studying alien flora. Now he was bonded to 3 extraordinary women who challenged, supported, and loved him in ways he'd never imagined possible. That night, as they lay together in a bedroom designed to accommodate their unusual family structure, Tobias listened to the synchronized breathing of his partners and felt gratitude that went beyond words. No regrets, Naya murmured against His shoulder, none, he replied honestly. Questions about the future? Vera asked from his other side. Many, he admitted, but I think that's part of the adventure. Fears, Leela whispered from where she rested against his chest. Tobias considered the question seriously. Only one, he said finally, that I might wake up and discover this was all a dream. The three sisters exchanged glances in the dim light, their individual luminescence creating a soft glow that made the room feel magical. Then don't wake up, Leela said with characteristic artistic flair. Stay in this dream with us. Vera added with philosophical precision. Forever, Naya concluded with warrior's determination. As sleep claimed him, surrounded by the warmth and light of his chosen family, Tobias realized that sometimes the greatest adventures weren't found in distant galaxies or dangerous expeditions. Sometimes they were found in the simple, revolutionary act of allowing yourself to love and be loved completely. Outside their window, Asteria's twin moons began their nightly dance across the star-filled sky, casting silver light on a world where a human botanist had discovered that the most exotic life forms weren't always the ones you studied in laboratories. Sometimes they were the ones you chose to build a life with.